Hi everyone, welcome to this weird little corner of my house where I talk about weird little books. Today I've got a fantastic short story to talk about for anyone who's interested. I've had this Penguin Classics copy of some of the works of Clark Ashton Smith for a very, very long time. This one in particular is The Dark Eidolon and Other Fantasies. It's interesting that they chose the Dark Eidolon to be the story that gets the title here, that the book is named after. But I think if you take a close look at this story, you'll easily understand why the Dark Eidolon gets the top billing here. Clark Ashton Smith, in general, is a fantastic writer of weird fiction, contemporary of H.P. Lovecraft, but definitely receiving a little bit more praise in academic and literary circles for his use of language. In many ways, even his prose reads like poetry when you read it, and The Dark Eidolon is perhaps one of the most descriptively powerful pieces that Clark Ashton Smith ever produced. What's more is, besides the artistic merit of Clark Ashton Smith's rather weird fantasy tales, there's also a lot of, I would say, literary merit to his work. This guy isn't just writing entertaining stories. He's not just writing incredible sentences that will get you to think about the beauty of language, even when he's describing, frankly, really terrible stuff. He's also got more going on under the hood, as we might say. There's a lot more that we can get out of Clark Ashton Smith's stories, not just in terms of the artistic value, but also in terms of some kind of not just moral lesson, a kind of edifying knowledge of the human condition, but also some kinds of artistic statement that the author is making as well. So, as both an artist and, let's say, a philosopher, we're seeing a bit of the author in the stories in ways that you wouldn't normally associate with, again, kind of the crass title of horror author. And in fact, I would argue that most of these stories don't even go into the realm of a horror story, though they certainly have horrifying elements. I should note here that the works of Clark Ashton Smith have been published in many, many different places. I know just a few years ago, a really nice multi volume set was made that had basically all of his work in it. And I own quite a few of the volumes in that series if I don't own them all. But what I have right here, of course, is the Penguin Classics, featuring the Dark Eidolon, along with some other stories, Maze of the Enchanter, for instance. A lot of these stories are all about specifically Clark Ashton Smith's Zothique setting. If you don't know anything about that, that's perfectly okay. Really, you don't need that kind of background information going in here. But yes, if you want to find more of the author's work, it's readily available. I'm not sure who the rights holder is. I know that these works aren't exactly free like H.P. Lovecraft's stuff is. There's still somebody who theoretically you have to pay to get your hands on this work. But in any case, it's highly worth it looking for any kind of collection of these stories. So let's get into the Dark Eidolon. The tale begins by quoting from a poem, The Tale of Zithra. Zithra being an important personage in Clark Ashton Smith's Zothique mythos. Here we are introduced to the moving force behind this story, the Lord of Evil, Thasidon. The poem goes something like this: Thasidon, Lord of seven hells, wherein the single serpent dwells. Thasidon, son of never Poseidon, son of nether skies, thine ancient evil never dies. Man's heart enthrones thee, still supreme, though the false sorcerers blaspheme. Here, once again, we can see an incredible flair for poetry that goes through all of Clark Ashton Smith's work. This is a guy who was praised for his poetry very early on in his literary career. Some people think he should have just stuck with the poetry instead of going off and writing weird fiction, but for our purposes, we're glad that he moved on. This excellent poem by Smith paints an excellent picture of this figure, Poseidon. We get an allusion to the biblical serpent with a capital S, creating an equivalence between whatever this being is and Satan, of course, of Judeo-Christian lore. We're also given a reason as to why Poseidon is immortal. He is enthroned upon the hearts of men. In other words, it seems as though this being of evil lives within every man. Of course, they always talk about the divide between good and evil being down the middle of a man's heart. We're given a motivation for this deity, this being. He wishes to have control of the hearts of men. And it seems that by committing evil deeds, human beings honor Poseidon, this entity. Although this poem at first might seem like it's simply a way to draw the reader into the story, it actually contextualizes the events of the story, which we'll get into later. Our narrator explains that on Zothique, new stars without number had declared themselves in the heavens, and after a period of absence, old gods are returning to dwell with mankind. But along with them come elder demons, deities like the gods, who feed on the fumes of evil sacrifice and foster primordial sorceries. Smith makes the distinction between demons and gods here, but I feel as though this is more like a characterization of good and bad gods. Think of it as the Olympians versus the Titans, perhaps, the Aesir versus the Jotnar in Norse mythology, and other such distinctions in world mythology. Because these deities, and we'll get into it, seem to more or less work the same way, whether they are good or bad. Nonetheless, it's important for us to recognize a difference in the type of worship that's going on here on Zothique. The demons of old desire specifically evil sacrifice, which is given in exchange for primordial sorceries. There's a transactional relationship here. Now, in the ancient world, which I'm sure Smith is drawing on here, all relationships between God and man are transactional. It's all about humans giving sacrifices and the gods giving boons in turn. I believe it's the evil nature of these sacrifices that sets the gods of evil, the ancient demons, apart from other gods. But there is an ancient relationship of reciprocity, as you would expect in the pagan world. Anyways, moving on. We are introduced to Namira, by far the greatest sorcerer on Zothique. He is said to impose his will on many cities and boasts of being an archdemon himself. We are told the story of the great mage's youth, how he was once named Narthos, and how in the past, as a mere beggar boy, he was trampled horribly by a prince named Zotula riding upon a horse. Of course, Zotula will grow up to become the king of one of the most powerful realms in the world, while Narthos will be taken in and healed by a hermit named Ufalok. Nemira becomes a mighty master of magic over the years, but he never stops plotting vengeance upon the prince who did him wrong when he was still powerless. Eventually, both the evil wizard and the debauched emperor find themselves in the same city of Umaus. Here, the emperor rules, but the sorcerer also dwells, untouchable by all other men. Smith's narrator informs us that it is a time of horrible wickedness upon the earth, very much akin to the Sodom of biblical lore. Zotula is a tyrannical king, but the people in general are also evil, and they acclaim his reign. Essentially, an evil king propped up by evil doers, and though there are still good people in the world, they are relatively few in number. This is the epitome of a dog-eat-dog world. The gods turn a blind eye. They allow the evil Emperor Zotula to do as he wishes. At least, that's how it appears. And his sins become as over-swollen fruits that ripen above a deep abyss. Here we see abyssal language being used, the language of the void. This again is actually a form of foreshadowing. One night, after a massive feast in his capital, Emperor Zotula awakens to find that a large vacant common area near his palace is suddenly occupied. It now contains a massive building, equal in size to his palace, but terrifying in appearance. The emperor, of course, sends his underlings to inquire who is behind this appearance, and is, of course, horrified and frightened, his lips trembling and the color leaving his face, when he is told that it is the arch-sorcerer Nemira who is responsible. As is typical with Smith's works, there's an excellent description of this awful palace as given by the townsfolk. They say that the foundations of the home were laid on the adamantine cope of hell, and in its floors were pits at whose bottom burned the nether fires. And the followers of Nemira were the dead of strange kingdoms, the demons of sky and earth and the abyss, and mad, impious, hybrid things the sorcerer himself had created from forbidden unions. We're going to get into what these hybrid things might be later, but just to give you an idea, Nemira here is one of the absolute best necromancer figures I have ever seen in fantasy fiction. He is just so extra in absolutely everything that he does. It's really amazing, and it's a lot of fun to read. But we'll get into that in a second. Smith just has an unmatched way with words. I know that many people describe Smith's works as overly verbose, and I certainly feel that at times, especially when he's writing high fantasy. For example, I don't exactly know why we need to refer to a causeway as a causey in one such example. There are other examples, like, for example, he talks about dragons being like egreted, like as in having the feathers of an egret on their head. That's in the Maze of the Enchanter. Again, absolutely feels unnecessary. I find this story, however, to be just the perfect level of description. There are no words out of place here, and it paints such a vivid picture of the power of this evil sorcerer and the realm in which he lives. We really get the feeling that going into his realm is to descend into hell. It really resembles the Inferno. And I also loved, once again, we have to go back to hybrid things, right? Nemira's creations are hybrid things, a la Ambrose Bierce's The Damned Thing. There's no satisfactory way to describe whatever these people are looking at. They're not even going to try. Later that night, Zotula's palace is assaulted. with his beautiful beds of exotic flowers trampled underfoot by what can only be guessed to be some kind of invisible horde of horses trampling through his halls and making a demoniac racket. At this point, Zotula is absolutely terrified, but in typical tyrannical fashion, he attempts to brag and boast his way out of the predicament, declaring that he will set his heel upon the dog's neck and have him stretched on the torture wheel. In reality, the emperor does nothing because he knows that nothing can spare him from this viceroy of Poseidon, this incredibly powerful sorcerer. But again and again, the horses visit, leaving their hoof prints upon the ground, and the emperor begins to break down into a nervous wreck. Every night from midnight to dawn, the halls are tormented by sounds of invisible horses thundering through the halls. I find in here an echo of the story of Beowulf, wherein the hall of King Hrothgar is nightly terrorized by the ogre Grendel, with all of the king's men being powerless to stop it. One must imagine that the Emperor Zotula is even more powerless, as he has no warrior from the north to call upon. Hoof prints cover the doors and are burned into all of the priceless artifacts of the king, ruining his wealth and spoiling his hall, which all have come to avoid. Zotula calls upon many priests and wizards, but none of them are able to give an answer as to how these things are happening, or if Nemira is really behind them. The priests are given sacrifices to give to their gods, but it seems to avail Zotula nothing. Are the gods powerless? More likely, I think, is that they wish to abandon the wicked king to his fate. Nonetheless, it is interesting to me that the only attempt to call upon good deities in this story ends in failure. It is my opinion that the good gods have no reason to intervene in this battle of evil versus evil. But it might be worth asking if the gods really could intervene in this fight, even if they wanted to. The wizards of the court go to Nemira and return with an invitation to a great feast. This is where the story starts to get really weird, in my opinion. All the wizards piece out of the city immediately, never to return. All of them having essentially seen some kind of personalized hell during their visit to Nemira's place. Nemira is straight up chilling next in his evil wizard house, pondering his orb and summoning his demons, having, and I quote, dismissed the mummies, the monsters, the skeletons, and the familiars which attended him ordinarily. Mummies, monsters, skeletons, and familiars. This guy has all of these weird, fantastical monsters just wandering around inside of his house. Most extra wizard I've ever heard of. He has mummy waiters. He has skeletons. He has familiars, I imagine, like rats and things like that. In any case, he goes to talk with an enormous jet black sculpture of the demon, his patron, Poseidon, which we are informed was crafted for a particularly evil king of the past, which of course is an interesting detail because it shows that worship of the Lord of Evil seems to be something that used to have official sanction in this world, and not just something crazy sorcerers do. Nemira just found it in some desert ruin and had it carted back to his place by some monsters, which again is a fun mental image, but not really the point here. We are informed that Nemira had asked a certain thing of Poseidon, and the fiend, replying through the statue, had refused him. And rebellion was in the heart of Nemira, grown mad with pride, and deeming himself lord of all sorcerers, and a ruler by his own right among the princes of devildom. And Nemira, in all his pride, begins to talk to his god as if he were an equal. Poseidon at first seems to take this pretty well, actually. He very reasonably explains that the people of Zotula's realm are, through their evil, basically faithful servants of his, who are not to be harmed or impeded in their acts of evil. Furthermore, he sees the Emperor Zotula as a very significant servant. Although he does not worship the Lord of Evil, he does so much evil on Earth that he is essentially honoring Poseidon inadvertently. The Demon King's argument makes a great deal of sense. He goes on to remind Nemira that he is only the greatest sorcerer in the world because of the trampling he suffered at the hands of Zotula. In some sense, he actually owes the evil prince for his present greatness. Poseidon even goes so far as to glaze Nemira here by calling him the lordliest of all necromancers who have accepted my service and my bond. I actually really came to like Poseidon through this conversation and his actions in the rest of the story, in part because everything he does and says seems to be incredibly reasonable, despite being the Lord of Evil, despite being Satan, you know? I believe that this is very intentional on Smith's part as the writer. We need to have some sort of undoing of the sorcerer through human flaws. The Smithian wizard is essentially invulnerable physically. There's nothing you can do to a sorcerer to physically destroy him, really. From the human part of the superhuman entity, it is the irrational mind, the susceptibility of even the greatest of men to folly, that ultimately will undo the wizard. He's too human for his own good. He's not really a god. Poseidon basically tells Nemira that he knows that the wizard is planning to call upon ancient and horrible gods to fulfill his wishes, but he advises him against it and quietly takes his leave. Nemira walks up some trippy stairs that seem to lead both upward and downward at the same time, and proceeds to a secret abyss, and utters a pre-human rune, that is some sort of ancient spell, calling upon the antediluvian powers, making a pact with entities who belonged neither to hell nor the mundane elements, and were more fearsome to invoke than the infernal genii or the devils of earth, water, and flame. With them he made his compact, defying Poseidon's will. Yes, this man basically said friendship ended with Satan. Yog-Sothoth is my best friend now. From here on, the story has some weird turns and some wonderful imagery, although the ending has now become a foregone conclusion. Zotula loads himself up with blessings from all of the gods of his realm and waits in his hall, unsure if he wants to accept the invitation. Then a bunch of giant skeletons just break into his hall. And once again, we have to recognize what a Lord of the Flex Nemira is, because all the skeletons, it turns out, every single one, are dead kings. And they're all kitted out in fancy loincloths and headdresses. Then some mummies show up, and you just have to hear this part in its entirety. The mummies said in dusty accents, "All is made ready, and the feast awaits the arrival of Zotula." And the cerements of the mummies stirred and fell open at the bosom, and small rodent monsters, brown as bitumen, eyed as with accursed rubies, reared forth from the eaten hearts of the mummies like rats from their holes, and chittered shrilly in human speech, repeating the words. At this point, I understand that this man is a necromancer, but the sheer logistics of getting talking rats that live inside the chests of mummies who can also speak in human languages, this is just mind-boggling. This is the definition of what kids call aura these days. This guy has unlimited aura. In all my time reading fiction, I don't think I've ever heard of something as cool as what I am reading right now. This guy is an absolute baller. My man is evil Lord Maxing every single one of the mummies and the skeletons and all the monsters repeat the same message to Zotula's court. The emperor and all of his people are now all essentially in a trance and forced to march forward. They see some weird half-man, half-dragon things too. It's not elaborated on. It's just wild. The flexing does not end. As they sit down to feast, Nemira summons forth the skeleton of Zotula's own father, the man whom he had murdered with a snake to pour his wine. This man's own skeleton dad is pouring wine for him. And he has the snake on his skeleton. The snake that was used to murder him, it's right there and it's staring at Zotula the entire time. It is insane. It is impeccable revenge. Namira keeps on flexing, getting his devils and his satyrs out to play some, let's say, uncomfortable music. And then he calls forth his dancers. And my word, what a description we get here. At this point, all of Zotula's people are basically lying prone on the ground. Somehow they've been struck with complete paralysis, and yet they're still completely awake and able to sense what is going to happen next. Skeleton dancers come forward, and Namira casts a spell upon them to make them grow bigger and bigger and bigger. The giant skeletons proceed to then dance on top of the bodies of Zotula's courtiers, and we get this lovely description. Those whereon they danced were as grapes trampled for a vintage in autumn, and the floor ran deep with a sanguine must. That is maybe the most beautiful description of people being trampled to death that I've ever heard. After this, we come to the climax of the story. Namira summons even greater steeds from the sky. Remember, before he was attacking Zotula's hall with these celestial horses. The ethereal horde of horses then absolutely demolishes the city beneath their thundering hooves. Again, something parallel to the fate of Sodom in the Bible. And here we get explained directly why our man has been using horses the entire time to terrorize the Emperor, if we hadn't figured it out already. He speaks to the Emperor. Know, Zotula, that I have called upon the coursers of Thumagorgos, Lord of the Abyss, and the coursers will tread your empire down, even as your palfrey trod and trampled in former time the beggar boy named Narthos. And the eyes of Namira, filled with a vainglory of madness and bale, burned like malign, disastrous stars at the hour of their culmination. Men, women, and children are horribly trampled in the streets as the city's buildings collapse. A lot of Smith's wonderful language here kind of conceals the abject horror of what is happening. Smith is almost never writing horror per se, but his descriptive power and precise vocabulary often lead to haunting descriptions that are truly terrifying once you comprehend what is happening beneath all the language. There's so much excellent descriptive language used here, incredible similes and metaphors, there's too many to list them all. The despair of Zotula seeing his empire destroyed is described as a foul incubus on the shoulders of a man lost in some land of accursed night. It's marvelous stuff. I can't even begin to fathom how he came up with this kind of descriptive language. At long last, Zotula is killed, but through another act of twisted necromancy, Namira possesses the Emperor's body, leaving Zotula's spirit floating helplessly. His spirit is now forced to follow the sorcerer's commands. In one final insult to both the dead Emperor and to the Lord of Evil, Poseidon, Namira defiles the Dark Eidolon, that black statue of the Lord of Evil, and places the spirit of the Emperor within it. It's difficult to describe what an insult this is to a god in classical terms. That statue is essentially a house made for the god specifically to use and inhabit. And now imagine that you, as this god, have not only been kicked out, but somebody else has been moved into your place. Imagine, if you will, being kicked out of your apartment so that the landlord can give it to his cleaning lady. Namira is seriously tripping on his power at this point, and I put his in quotation marks. As we'll soon see, he's not as powerful as he believes. Now more absolutely sick shit happens as the Emperor's body, again, controlled by the sorcerer, grows glowing white hooves and horse-like legs, as if the presence of the sorcerer's soul is enough to mold the body into a new form. Really sick stuff. And then, of course, the wizard goes on to use the glowing hot hooves to torture the emperor's chief consort, basically his wife, who's been kind of a character in this story, but not much of one. The wicked emperor is forced to watch through the eyes of the Dark Eidolon. At this point, there awoke the manhood that had slumbered still unaroused before the ruining of his empire and the trampling under of his retinue. Immediately, a great abhorrence and a high wrath were alive in his soul. Then it seemed that a voice spoke within him. And this is some heavy metal stuff right here. I am Poseidon, lord of the seven hells beneath the earth, and the hells of man's heart above the earth, which are 7 times 7. For the moment, O Zotula, my power is become thine for the sake of a mutual vengeance. Be one in all ways with the statue that is my likeness, even as the soul is one with the flesh. Zotula, given one last chance to act with his own free will, raises up the mace in his stone hands and crushes it down upon the skull of the sorcerer, killing him instantly, the legs only faintly twitching for a time. And Obexa, the emperor's consort, screams and screams. Now the soul of the necromancer finds his old body and returns, but a curse is upon his mind, yet another gift from his lord. At once he believes himself to be hacking with a sword at Zotula. In the next moment, he is Zotula, attacking himself. In another moment, he is fighting an unknown enemy. The delirium brought about by the curse seems to be a fitting punishment for the wizard who thought himself so clever. Our story ends with the mad sorcerer, cursed to wage an unending war against an illusory foe until his own death, and the dying consort of the emperor now laughing maniacally, her own mind lost to the horror, as the servants of Thamagorgos smash what remains of the city, of the empire, to pieces. Now we get on to the analysis. I found this story interesting for a number of reasons, but one thing that stood out to me the most is that Smith chose to write a story not about the incredible power of a wizard or his conquest of the world, but of his demise through entirely preventable events. In The Sorcerer and Amira, we have a functionally omnipotent protagonist. Had he played his cards right, this guy could have ruled the world and possibly lived forever. Instead, he is brought low by nothing more than 2 things: his hubris and his desire for revenge. It's something we see in the best fiction. A compulsion so strong that no other considerations can stop it. A thirst that is unquenchable. A desire that cannot be sublimated. One immediately thinks of Herman Melville's classic Moby Dick. Vengeance, that desire to see a wrong paid back on one's abuser, is one of the strongest desires a human can have. It's the reason why we find ourselves wishing ill on people who did something as simple as cut us off in traffic. It's a large part of the reason why many people support harsh penalties, up to and including death, for murderers and other dangerous criminals. But many of our most ancient moral teachings tell us that vengeance is unproductive, self-destructive even, and should be cast aside. In Smith's story, we see a scenario in which the lust for vengeance overrides a man's ability to think clearly and consider his place in the world, and he pays for it, from the very height of power to a fate worse than death in a single day. Another thing that we can look at is the moral blackness of the story. There's no hero to get behind in this story, at least not on a moral level. The 2 main characters are betrayers and murderers who have done horrible things to get into their position. And the only supporting character, Obexa, is also a traitor who purposefully doomed one of her lovers to death in the past. And yet there's still a certain kind of catharsis that comes in the acts of vengeance that are done by evil characters. Readers might, like I did, take great joy in watching Namira take vengeance on his enemy in convoluted and eccentric ways. And I also found myself rooting for Zotula as he struck down the sorcerer near the end of the story in one final act of defiance. Again, this is the power of that theme of vengeance. When it comes down to a battle of villain against villain, we as the reader can feel self-assured in our enjoyment of the vengeance. We're able to relate to the vengeful sorcerer just as we're able to sympathize with the emperor in his last moment of freedom as he strikes down the prideful sorcerer who has gone too far. If there's a moral to this story, it's that revenge does not pay, and it leads to a man's ruin. But there's a sense of inevitability about the whole thing here as well. I feel as though Nomura was fated in a way to meet his fate. As I've mused before, he was able to, in so many ways, overcome his own humanity. But he was not able to shed that human interior. All of the human characters in this story were doomed by human nature. And that tragic human nature, to desire for revenge, even past the point of self-destruction, plays into the hands of the forces of evil in the world. In this case, the demon lord Poseidon faces only a momentary setback at the hands of his rebellious partner. Although many of his unwitting servants have died, he remains, as the poem at the beginning reminds us, enthroned in the hearts of men. There's one more deity that we have to talk about here, the Lord of the Abyss, Themagorgos. Perhaps the only complete winner in this scenario, if this being's intentions can even be perceived. Themagorgos wreaks untold destruction upon the earth through his summoning, laying an entire empire to waste. This dark and terrible force, seeming to stand beyond even the gods, seems to do nothing at all but destroy. A true force of entropy in this world. I find it notable that he has no dialogue, no personality, not even a hint of a personality. When his servant is in danger, the Lord of the Abyss does not intervene in the slightest. Were it not for the gigantic horses coming and trampling upon the ground, and of course the feats of evil that Namira is able to do, we wouldn't even really see Themagorgos as a force in this story at all. It seems that this god got everything that he wanted, using the sorcerer as a gateway into the world, and uncaring for his servant's survival once he got in. This seems to be what separates these primordial gods from the gods of men, and even from the king of the seven hells. There's no interest in manipulating human beings, or even looking for worship. They seem to only want a way to get into our world and destroy things. I have another note here about the role of a sorcerer in this story. Once again, we have to remember that the dichotomy in this story is not between good and evil. It is between the evil emperor on one side, the evil civilization, and the sorcerer, the evil outsider. In the ancient world, particularly in ancient Greece, practicing sorcery was a way of gaining the favor of the gods in ways which were not tied to normal religious practice. Religious actions in the ancient world were either done at the home, led by a male master of the house, or done in public, usually carried out by public officials on behalf of the city or the nation. There was little room in this system for the practice of any kind of personal religion or devotion. Ancient people did not really have a personal relationship with deities such as Zeus, as most Christians would say they have with Jesus Christ, for instance. All religious actions were transactional, based on the giving of gifts to the gods in exchange for gifts from them, gifts given according to one's power and the degree of the favor being asked. In the ancient world, sorcery was a way of cheating this system. It was in some ways the game genie of its time. Sorcery either twisted the hands of the gods, forcing them to do things for the sorcerer, or more often simply involved invoking the gods in ways that were not allowed by polite society. This would include things like men, and especially women, petitioning the gods for things for themselves, and also certain rituals that were used to gain power over others. Sorcery was, of course, a selfish act. It was usually used to gain power over a targeted person and bind them in some way. It did so by appealing to different gods than most other prayers. A very famous one from this time would be Abrasax or Abraxas, a god of sorcery, or by appealing to aspects of more popular gods that were often ignored in typical religious practice. All this is to say, although Smith's portrayal of sorcerers and wizards tends to give off the vibes of Satan worship, and Smith does lean into this depiction quite a bit, it's not necessarily demon worship. Rather, we're seeing men thinking outside the constraints of their own society. They seek out and call upon forces that are themselves either forgotten or shunned by others. By committing certain rites, they become in some way superhuman. And their powers are so great that they become completely untouchable by mortal men. In this story and in others, we see that the fundamental difference between the civilized world and the chaotic world of the sorcerer is not one of morality. Both sides are irredeemably evil. The battle is simply between those who fit into the system and those who do not.